Consoles, the machines that make playing games possible, unless you use a PC. People sometimes get weird about consoles. They swear allegiance to soulless corporations who care more about money than art, when a console's true value comes in its games. Sure, there are other factors, such as form factors, resolution, frame rate, teraflops is a word I've heard, bits and bytes, architecture and infrastructure, names and code names, and just the general appearance of the thing. Sometimes there's even a special selling point, like portability. But more than anything, it's the games. Typically the exclusives, but even the multiplats. And today, I'm looking back through the 9 generations to see which ones have stood the test of time. Cause I'm Nintendo Dope Man, and these are the Dopest Consoles. The granddaddy of them all. Designed by Ralph Baer while working for a defense contractor, this primitive pioneer contained just 40 transistors and diodes, 2 blocky dual-knob controllers, and 0 colors or sounds. At a time when all consoles from the arcade to the earliest seeds of handhelds were dedicated to just a single game, this was the first that was able to switch between several. This humble box was indeed the seed of the modern home video game console, where the profound concept of interacting with images on a screen was transplanted from the arcade to
the boxes that people live in. Talking about their homes?
Famously known as the Rolls-Royce of game consoles, the Neo Geo was created by arcade giant SNK, who sought to infiltrate the home market with the most advanced offer of the 16-bit era by using the exact same level of tech found in their cabinets. However, this led to a price point of $800 for a machine that was supported mostly just with fighting games, which themselves were $200 a freaking piece. The Neo Geo quietly died within 2 years of its birth, but is also silently remembered for being far ahead of its time. Perhaps by too much. I can't imagine anyone plays Atari games anymore. While it might be more famous now for being a flashy neon sign in Blade Runner, this was the first big name in video games. For a brief period in the late 70s, Atari was video games. Black plastic, wood paneling, and a simple 8-directional joystick. Nolan Bushnell and co. spent a year building a machine that was able to swap out ROM cartridges to play any number of games, which came in cool illustrated boxes, at a time when most home consoles were just single game machines meant to play Pong, which happened to be the company's pilot creation. However, while setting these now standard trends, the lack of a quality control system flooded store shelves with unlicensed shovelware at the same time as an oversaturation of other consoles in a burgeoning new industry. Culminating in the most infamously bad game to ever pollute a landfill, Atari killed the industry it birthed. Atari is a lot like Genghis Khan. It may be dead, but its DNA can be found in whole swaths of East Asia. Atari's successes as well as its failures are now the stuff of legends, and this console will always be remembered as the herald of this entertainment medium called video games. Valve is known for very few but highly revered titles. Arguably more famous than their games, however, is their distribution platform, Steam, which until recently was confined only to PC gamers. Then came the Steam Deck, a Nintendo Switch-style console version of the entire marketplace. There's only 3 things holding it back: Nintendo exclusives, a dreadfully short battery life, and a ridiculously high price point. Sega came out with too many consoles in a small time, so by the time their best one came out, it was too late. It's a shame, really, because the Dreamcast had a lot of potential. A built-in modem, visionary controllers, and an array of titles that either invented new genres or reinvented old ones. Unfortunately, Sega's best console was their last, and they stagnated into one of the more lackluster third-party developers of our world. A greater sign of things to come for the Blue Blur at large.
Sega Dreamcast!
Okay, seriously, who the f taught Microsoft to count? The rival to the PS4 was the Xbox One, and along with about the same power stats and multiplats, it didn't offer much beyond HDR, 4K, game streaming, cloud storage, various multimedia options.
PS4 doesn't have the seamless transition between games, movies, and TV offered by Xbox One.
I guess it did offer a lot. By the next gen, Microsoft gave up on counting and switched to letters. Either way, the Series X is their most PC console yet. It literally looks like a desktop tower. And while it's losing the console war to yet another PlayStation, it's an impressive machine that will likely boast some impressive exclusives due to their acquisition of Bethesda and Activision.
We cannot let them take from us our PC.
The sleekest appearance, the state-of-the-art tech, and the options between physical or digital, and the already awesome standard DualShock, or the holy fuckballs DualSense. Since this is the current generation, which has been so far more underwhelming than expected, it's hard to rank it from a historical perspective. Still, this is a premier high-end console. The 7th generation was Nintendo's most experimental hardware era, and on the portable side was the Nintendo DS. DS stood for dual screens, the bottom of which was a touchscreen. Long before smartphones, Nintendo dabbled in this now prescient technology, and it led to some equally experimental game designs touching on every genre from Metroidvanias and RPGs to simulators and visual novels. With its accessible appeal, low price point, and rechargeable battery, the Nintendo DS was wildly successful and grew into a whole family of iterations that comprise the second most sold console to date. Following the massive success of the Game Boy, you'd think the Game Boy Advance would have had a longer life cycle than 3 years. And with such a short lifespan, you'd think that there wouldn't be very much content for it. And yet, those 3 little years were stuffed with a wealth of games. It was also backwards compatible, so every cartridge dating back to 1989 did not go to waste. The basic model was okay, but with its sleek and foldable form factor, backlit screen, and rechargeable battery, the GBA SP was a Nintendo fan's dream console for a long, long time. Although it got off to a rocky start, the Nintendo 3DS eventually dethroned the GBA SP as the ultimate Nintendo console. And what did it? Was it Street Pass? Those weird little AR cards? Or the glasses-free stereoscopic visuals that nearly all of us turned off anyway? Nope. It was the games. A bevy of beloved and impactful exclusives, backwards compatibility with the enormous DS library, and the final vestige of the Virtual Console. NES, Game Boy, other stuff, and eventually SNES games on the family's best iteration. Literally the only thing that was missing were the games that were included in the Ambassadors program for those foolishly loyal yet judiciously wise enough fans who adopted the system early during its overpriced launch period. I adore my Majora's Mask Edition new Nintendo 3DS, and when I die, I seriously want to be buried with that thing. We're all limited on time, and most of us are limited on money. Hard and software devs vying for them both is the crux of every console war. Some people need just one console, and many just need a PC with Steam and a whole bunch of emulators. But many gamers' ideal setup is a Nintendo console and then a choice between Sony and Microsoft. While the Xbox was never my choice, while FPSs like Halo were never my favorite, and while I resent online gaming, I cannot underestimate the impact and popularity of them all of which started under the black and green banner of the most significant non-Japanese console since the Atari. This was a tough spot to choose. The Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, NES, Famicom, just Nintendo, whatever you want to call it, is arguably the most important game console of all time. It single-handedly resurrected the industry that Atari had killed. The word Nintendo became so synonymous with the word video games that the company had to release a statement, and it had nothing to do with anything but the quality of the games.
Where is the Nintendo?
We don't have a Nintendo. We got a ColecoVision plugged into the black and white TV.
Oh my god, this is like a third world country.
Until this machine, most video games were granular, bite-sized experiences designed for the arcades. But when this came out, it allowed for fully realized projects. This was the origin of countless pedigree IPs: Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Final Fantasy, Castlevania, Mega Man, the list goes on. So why ranked so relatively low? Well, it's not easy to revisit today. The games can be relatively rudimentary and frustratingly difficult. The only ones I find worth playing myself is the Mario trilogy, and even then I choose the All-Stars makeover I grew up with. Regardless, this is the most historically important console of all time. The phoenix that rose from the ashes of an American invention and established Japan as the gaming capital of the world.
Now you're playing with power.
The Wii was a phenomenon. While Sony and Microsoft duked it out in a cage match of power stats, Iwata steered Nintendo's ship into newer, uncharted business waters called the Blue Ocean. It wasn't powerful, it wasn't expensive, but it was so damn popular because it was different. Everyone and their grandma had a Wii. This thing is credited with expanding the gaming audience to people who before this would have never bought a PS2 or an N64 or an Atari or anything. This was also reflected in the game design of both new and old IPs. The Wii also featured Nintendo's first online marketplace, the sorely missed Virtual Console, where people could digitally purchase retro games from all their past systems except for the one that it was backwards compatible with, as well as some former rival consoles and some other nifty apps like Netflix and a web browser. And of course, the main attraction, the motion controls. The Wiimote and Nunchuck were as revolutionary as the console's codename implied, and while this was the generation I lost interest in Nintendo due to their rise of kiddiness and gimmickiness, I cannot undermine its lasting impression on the entire world. It was around this generation that games started feeling a little too big for little old me. Massive open worlds that either feel empty and hollow or never seem to end. DLC and microtransactions and patches for games that seemed purposely unfinished upon release. It felt like taking the reins of a second life at a time when real life was becoming too busy. However, in that same breath, it felt like a culmination of the art form. How much farther could it go? Was this the finish line of game design? The PS4 boasted the finest graphics, the deepest mechanics, and the most varied features of its time.
PS4 controller has a touchpad interface.
The only thing the Xbox of the time had over it was backwards compatibility, but with several great remakes and a relatively robust online store, there was virtually zero competition. The first true portable games console. And I'm including Game Boy Color in here too, even though most people consider it a separate system. Game Boy is as household a name as Nintendo itself. It launched with the legendary Tetris, went out in a blaze of glory with Pokemon, and hosted an absolute treasure trove of quality titles in between, many of which still hold up today. The Game Boy is home to some of the earliest and fondest memories of many gamers, and the best part was, we could take it anywhere we wanted. School, the playground, grandma's house, road trips, or just another room in the house. No matter what we had to leave, the game never had to leave us. The PS3 was an interesting time. It combines the best of both worlds, those worlds being the two generations it lies between. Games were big, but not overwhelming. Graphics weren't as hyper-realistic as the next gen, but aged far better than the previous one. Sony introduced their first digital marketplace, but it was not yet poisoned by the model's worst elements, including an online subscription fee. It even featured a Blu-ray player, and if you treated yourself to the original fatty launch model, you were treated to the last time they gave a true f*** about backwards compatibility. Although its cell processor and SPUs were difficult to develop for, this is where a new standard of lush gaming experiences flourished, whose foundations can still be found in games today. Nintendo vs. Sega, the OG console war. Yet I was such a Nintendo kid, I didn't even know there was a war going on. I did know about Sonic the Hedgehog though, and this system was his genesis, along with many people's first gaming memories and experiences. Bullishly targeting the MTV generation with a punky adolescent attitude that proudly proclaimed Sega does what Nintendo don't, the Sega Genesis offered a wide variety of experiences, covering every genre with at least one classic, and an architecture to perfectly replicate their own arcade heritage. Even though Nintendo won that war as well as overall longevity, Sega and their speedy mascot were racing ahead for a good while, and many people today still consider themselves Sega kids at heart, thanks to this legendary console. The GameCube is a tough console to rank. By sales figures, it's one of Nintendo's least successful ventures, but by all other metrics, it's one of their very best creations. A humble yet sophisticated architecture housed within a toy-like yet sleek shell offered in a variety of colors. A controller that looked laughable at first glance, but felt like destiny at first touch. And although Nintendo's transition from carts to discs seemed reluctant with its small proprietary CDs, it was also their first stab at making a home console portable with its cute little handle. Even that little power on intro and menu was awesome. But of course, nothing defines this machine more than the games it was built for and for it. While the GameCube may have looked cute, it was home to some of Nintendo's biggest, bestest, maturest, most experimental titles aimed squarely at the core gaming audience. The final time they would target that demographic for 2 whole generations. From its devilishly sexy reveal at Space World 2000 to the nostalgic memories it rapidly triggers, it's possibly the only console to achieve the status of a cult classic. The 360th Xbox. As I said before, I never owned an Xbox, so I had to rank them with my gut, based on their success, industry influence, and exclusive content. And if my memory serves me well, the Xbox 360 was the most popular, successful, valuable console in Microsoft's whole line. I have so many memories of losing so many Halo matches at so many friends' houses, but nevertheless had so many good times that I almost sometimes wish that I owned one. The only Xbox to ever win a console war also featured the first digital marketplace, the first HD resolution, the first wireless controller, and the creation of achievements. Additionally, it offered a more robust online infrastructure and multimedia experience. And while they couldn't count very well, it's still the best named Xbox. Except maybe the original. Xbox is a pretty cool name, I must admit. That's because this thing went full circle. total revolution, a full 360 degrees, to the point that it extended the average life expectancy of the home console life cycle.
Because that's how Xbox people are.
From 16 bits to 64, ambitiously skipping the 32 model, the Nintendo 64 was Nintendo's, and in many hearts and minds, the world's first 3D game console. It was a wild privilege to be alive in gaming during this transitionary period. It feels like we grew up alongside the art form. Naturally, such an experimental time had its growing pains. Expensive and limited cartridges caused many devs and pubs to jump ship to the newly minted PlayStation, and the designs of many games have aged less gracefully than those of other consoles. Still, it remains home to many eternal masterpieces, including the still highest rated game of all time. And although the three-pronged controller was as alien looking then as it is now, no one can doubt the ever-relevant impact of its analog joystick that allowed for accurate 3D movement. Add to that the advent of the Rumble Pack, and the console was technologically advanced as it was obsolete, ahead of its time and behind its time. Some say the N64 is fun only for those who still harbor nostalgia for it, and although it sounds like I'm proving them right, you just had to be there. The Sony PlayStation. I'm not saying Nintendo is for kids or Sega was for teenagers, but the PS1 was the moment that finally felt like gaming grew up and reached an adult audience. Even though there were plenty of games for kids and is now a popular console choice among all age groups, this was the start of mature RPGs and racers and survival horrors, and like the NES before it, countless legendary IPs got their start on this launchpad, created by Ken Kutaragi as a business vendetta after being stiffed by Nintendo and Sega. With its disc-based tech, shitty but nostalgic tank controls used on the still iterated and mimicked DualShock, and an architecture that was powerful yet simple, the original PlayStation was a glorious end to the glorious 90s, and the usher of 3D gaming. This console changed everything, and a new king was crowned. Looking in from the outside, it can sometimes feel like Nintendo is always trying to recapture the glory days of their 80s NES dominance. And while that's true to an extent, they're always simultaneously looking to improve. That point was quickly proven with their second ever home console, the Super Nintendo. The original NES was a revolution, but the SNES was an evolution. Do it all over again, but this time do it super. The result was the final and definitive era and platform of 2D gaming. Gorgeous pixelated artwork, a colorful standalone sound palette, and a comfier controller with the now ubiquitous 4-face button diamond. While the NES has aged like milk, the Super NES aged like wine. The things they accomplished with 16 little bits is nothing short of remarkable. The reason Nintendo beat Sega was the sheer quality of its games. This thing was a masterpiece machine, a pure concentration of AAA titles, games that many people still consider the best of their series and genres. It was the third parent that raised us, the root of all nostalgia. It simply truly was, in a word,
now you're playing with power. Superpower.
Still the highest selling console of all time. Still the dopest PlayStation after all this time. This small black box changed the game. In its time, it was among the most common household appliances. This is the moment when games finally flourished into full cinematic experiences, and whose quality were still matched by quantity. The PS2 had the most Rockstar games, the most new and exclusive IPs, the first open-world sandbox games, and the best survival horror games. And like the PS3's Blu-ray capabilities after it, the PS2 ushered in the VHS-killing DVD era. In fact, the PS2 was an omen of multimedia technology and culture. This was the console that shifted the balance of power between the games industry and all other entertainment industries. The PS1 may have changed gaming, but the PS2 changed the world. Did you see it coming? You should have. Just for a minute, forget the fact that this had the first open-world Zelda, the first home console Pokemon, the first 3D Kirby, the return of 3D Mario, the long-awaited Metroid Dread and Prime 4, the ultimate Smash Brothers, and an endless barrage of quality first-party titles covering every single IP in Nintendo's storied history. Forget the games for 1 minute. This is a list of the dopest consoles. And while consoles are mere vessels that are best judged by the games they host, this was a different story. Nintendo is always experimenting. Sometimes it ended up in a dud, and sometimes they would establish a new standard. Gimmick or innovation, you never know until you try. As demonstrated in the console's pre-launch presentation, the Nintendo Switch combined them all. The D-pad, face buttons, analog sticks, touchpad, rechargeable battery, motion controls, advanced HD rumble, 2D and 3D were all packed into two nifty controllers dubbed Joy-Cons that could be single-wielded with the grip, dual-wielded on their own, separated into two separate controllers for multiplayer, or slid on the sides of a sleek tablet-style screen, housing the best technology we never thought they'd embrace, all in the service of its ultimate selling point, portability. The ability to switch seamlessly between playing at home on a TV via the dock or anywhere else in the fucking world. A hybrid console. Portability was always Nintendo's greatest innovation, which resulted in decades of two separate console lines. The Switch finally merged them into one machine that plays all the ways and gets all the games, including so many third-party titles that have abandoned Nintendo for generations before. Yeah, the online service kinda sucks, and Switch Online isn't nearly as good as the Virtual Console. The moment this generation started, we knew we were in for the time of our lives, and we dreaded its end. A mere year before this, many had written off Nintendo as a lost cause, a future third party, the next Sega. And out of nowhere, they resurge in the greatest comeback story ever told with their highest selling console, which has the highest volume of software output and the highest echelon of a feature. This beautiful product is the culmination of everything the Big N has ever done in their 40-year history as a video game company, their 60-year history as a toy company, and their over 130-year history as an entertainment company. Plus, of course, all the games is what makes the Nintendo Switch the dopest console of all time. Some say that console gaming is slowly dying, creating a vacuum for PCs and VR and AR and whatever other two-letter acronyms loom ahead. But the truth is that the mediums of storytelling entertainment are constantly evolving, from cave paintings to the written word to live theater to film to video games. What comes next? It will most likely occur far past our lifetimes, but no matter how awesome it will be, I am forever grateful that I got to live in the time of video games. So sub to the channel, smash that like button, and leave a comment about the dopest console that you have ever owned. The one that made you say,
This is an excellent rectangle.
Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. When I was dead broke, man, I couldn't picture this.